friends. Glad that you're tuning in. So happy to welcome Jared Goldfarb to the podcast today. Um, I've known Jared for quite a few years now. I'm trying to remember what was the first year we engaged, but it's been quite a while. And I've had numerous opportunities to experience Jared's excellence as an educator, as I've taken groups to visit Israel and Palestine over the years. The trips that I was a part of and that I organized always included not just religious tourism, but an in-depth take, as best we could accommodate within the amount of time we had, of current conditions in Israel-Palestine, the peoples of the area, the history of the area. And of course, you get an enormous amount of history when you do religious, thoughtful religious pilgrimage as well. Jared is extremely versed in all areas like that, including the contemporary as well as the historic and the religious and the intersections of the traditions. Very knowledgeable. And I'm glad Jared was able to join me because I'm interested in the conversation of what it was like living in the meantime in Israel and Palestine during these days. And I have a lot of confidence in Jared's capacity to interpret for us what life is like and what are the values that structure his days and how he lives into those. But Jared, I think maybe a way to begin is for you to tell our listeners who you think you are. Who are you, Jared? Let us, from your perspective, describe to our listeners who you are.
Thank you, Stephen. It's a joy to be this close to you. I wish it were a little closer, but nonetheless,
It will come.
From Jerusalem to New York is a little bit of a distance. I'm currently in the United States. That's certainly worth mentioning. I did grow up in the United States, in the beautiful state of New Hampshire. Lived in Boston for a while, went to university in Boston, and I have been living in Jerusalem for the last 30 years. What essentially brought me to the land of Israel, to the Holy Land, was sort of a search for my own identity as a Jew. Growing up in New Hampshire, it was a very limited, shall we say, Jewish experience. And so as a bit of a late bloomer, exploring my Jewish identity as a young adult, it became clear that the historic land of Israel, certainly from a biblical perspective, but a narrative perspective, was a critical component of one's Jewish identity. And I had not had that experience like many of my peers. And so I took advantage of that in my early 20s. And what I thought would be just sort of an exploratory adventure, learning a little bit of the geography, learning a little bit of Hebrew, turned into what is now a lifelong loving relationship with my new home. So Jerusalem has been my home for 30 years. Initially, my existence there was primarily focused on me. To be quite blunt, learning about my new environment, figuring out how I fit in as a Jew into the sort of the Israeli construct, and doing a lot of learning, catching up on many years that I didn't have, in terms of understanding the Jewish bookshelf and Jewish practice and ritual and holidays, etc. And the longer I stayed, the more confident I became in knowing that Jerusalem was my home and that a place that I love tremendously. But I also became more aware of the world around me, and got to know many of the other communities, faith identities, national identities, and such. And so over time, I kind of shifted a little bit away from a world of Jewish learning and Jewish education. I found myself actually leading a Jewish Institute for Learning, strictly focused on sort of the traditional Jewish texts of Bible and the rabbinic commentaries, Mishnah and Talmud. And so I kind of shifted away from that in an attempt to not only educate myself about the land and its peoples, but also to really understand what it meant to live in that moment, in what I would now call Israel-Palestine, because it's sort of
Yes.
much more fuzzy than just kind of having the blinders on and seeing it as my land, my story, my people.
Let me interrupt one moment. That's an interesting point. So you actually went through a process of now identifying yourself as in the land of Israel-Palestine.
Yes. Yeah, the
Interesting.
more I got to know my neighbors, my colleagues, sort of through a series of circumstances, I won't go into the whole story, but I actually ended up teaching Jewish studies, which was my early career, in non-Jewish environments, primarily Christian environments in
Right,
Jerusalem,
right.
where ironically, most of the staff and many of the faculty were Palestinians, both Palestinian Christians and Palestinian Muslims. And so that was one way that I really got to know the communities beyond my cozy little Jewish bubble, both my neighborhood and really the entire half of Jerusalem in which I lived. And so getting to know those communities sort of became my next passion, understanding their stories, their narratives, their history and connection to land in the same way that I had really come to feel quite comfortable and rooted in my own story and my own connection.
Just as an
Um,
aside, and uh, my experience of experiencing Israel-Palestine physically and personally was in some ways very life-changing for some of the reasons you're touching on, which I didn't expect, and it had to do with the land itself, the place, the formative condition of the formative conditions that gave birth to these religious traditions that are at the backbone of Western civilization. Ultimately,
mhm.
that was a deeply stirring experience for me personally, and it caused me to believe that, God, boy, it would be a good idea if say American Christians could certainly find their way over to Israel-Palestine for that experience of immersion in the actual land and the experience of the peoples and in the
Yes,
suffer and in the chronic suffering of the peoples.
right.
Anyway, I just wanted to kind of underscore that as a personal uh, matter for me.
And the good news is, I should just share, is not only is that one of the ways that you and I met was
Yeah,
through, a congregant being a student of mine in one of the many programs that exist, but it's nice to know that there actually are, um, at least in normal times, not in the last
right.
2 years, of course, but in normal times, there are many, many opportunities for people around the world, specifically Americans and English speakers, to be
Yeah,
able to come and not just have that sort of very narrow but important experience of how do I connect to this place, but a learning experience of sitting and studying and encountering the
right.
world that makes up, Israel-Palestine. And I feel very blessed that now, since I've made that shift, which is already more than 20 years ago, I have spent most of my current career teaching in those environments. So not only teaching Jewish studies, but also as a student, a very passionate student of history, teaching the narratives, right? And as you said, the intersectionality of faith identity, politics, land, the land itself,
Right.
and everything that has happened, over thousands of years in that tiny little region.
Yeah. So, you've been there 30 years living, correct? You said?
Yep.
And you have a family. And by the way, when you went, you didn't have to serve in the military, did you?
Well,
Or
technically
did you?
speaking, every Jew has to check in, meaning
Okay.
there's the ease of immigration for a Jew, which important to note is not the same for non-Jews who may want to explore a life in the land. But as a Jew, it's quite simple to be able to immigrate, to make aliyah, as we say in Hebrew, going up to the sacred land. But once you do that, there are some obligations. Because I was already just beyond the age of young adult, sort of that primary age of military service, I was deemed unnecessary by the IDF, which may have actually worked out quite well for them and for me. I have found
I get the
mostly
point.
because I struggle with sort of authority on lots of different grounds, be it, religious authority, political authority. So I have found many alternative ways to serve my country, through volunteering, through education, working with various communities on lots of different issues. But no, I did not do military service. However, I do have 3 children.
Yes.
I raised them. They were all born in Jerusalem, raised in Jerusalem. And 2 of them have now, well, my eldest finished her national service. Turns out not military service through a kind of a complex arrangement depending on one's identity as a Jew in the state of Israel. So she did civil service for 3 years, and I have my middle son who is now doing, he's in his second of 6 years of military service,
Wow.
because he's in an elite intelligence unit. And my
Interesting.
youngest is about to graduate high school, and so he is looking ahead at what his service to the country might look like.
And is it the way they serve, is it their choice? Like you said, your middle son was it was in a 6-year intelligence program. Did he choose that or was he assigned that?
He did. It A lot of things are sort of predetermined, partly by your identity growing up, even meaning which high school you go to can
Oh,
sort of set you
interesting.
up on different paths, whether you're religious or secular, and sort of how you choose to kind of prepare yourself for that moment where you're conscripted. Some of it has to do with your academic path. My son happens to be a brilliant young man, very much into science and computers, ended up at the National Science Academy, studying for his last 3 years of high school. And as a result of that, like many of his peers, he was sort of recruited into these elite intelligence units because they kind of know that if you're in that high school, it's probably a good place to
I
start.
see. I see.
So a lot of these young people in his world end up in some of those units. But there is that element of, the military, as you would expect, sort of a national conscription plan. The
Right.
military has to work with the youth to a certain extent to make sure that there's a bit of a match, given that they're bringing in, tens, if not hundreds of thousands of young people every year. So they have to try to navigate that. It's a fairly complex process. I'm now going through it, as I said, for my third time with my youngest. But it's not entirely up to the youth. At the end
Okay.
of the day, the military has a decision to make.
It's interesting. I wasn't expecting to have this conversation particularly, but I'm intrigued by it in the sense that what do you have? What's your point of view about mandatory service?
That's a great question. I would say the idea of service is fascinating, and I am fully behind it. Especially growing up in the United States, where, as far
Yeah.
as I knew as a young kid in New Hampshire, I didn't really know anybody who did any kind of service in any way, shape, or form.
Right.
So the idea of serving one's country, I think, is quite fascinating, for better or for worse. Probably, in my opinion, a little bit for the worse. We live in a region that is highly militaristic, both Israel and most of her neighbors. And so that kind of creates a different kind of conceptualization of what serving one's country is. It's not just about your commitment to your country. It's very much connected to the military reality,
Yeah.
of the many wars and conflicts, that certainly Israel, if not everyone in the region, has found themselves in. As an educator, as a peace activist, I am not a huge fan of warfare, or specifically military conscription, but living in the state of Israel, I have come to accept that that is a major path that you don't generally have a way out of, although there are exceptions for those who kind of know the current political climate in Israel. There are some major exceptions that cause a
Yes.
tremendous amount of tension in Israeli society, but we'll set that aside for
Yeah.
now.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I have struggled with is, on one hand, being a very proud Israeli, having chosen, to live in that land and raise my children there. So I want to commit, I want to fulfill, I want to contribute. But at the same time, I have raised my children in sort of an environment of, peace, an environment of diplomacy and education and encounter, as a way of not even needing to get to that kind of militaristic component. So I have to take the responsibility on my own shoulders. I have raised children who had many sort of ethical moments, and kind of moral challenges considering their military service, knowing that, here I was, their father in the background, that was always encouraging them to take a slightly different path. And many, they believed in it, right? So how does a young person kind of grapple with those two worlds, at the same time? On the one hand, seeing their Palestinian neighbors and peers as friends and as equal human beings. But on the other hand, we have a major national narrative in the land, not just us, but everybody around us, but certainly from our point of view, that non-Jews are often seen as other, or even worse, as the enemy. And so entering into military service can really bring those two into conflict.
Yeah, yeah. Do you locate your commitment to your peace activities within your religious faith? How does
For
what's
sure.
the can you say a word about that? Because Christians, of course, all religions have various schools of thought within their own right within their own theologies. I'm kind of curious how you locate yourself in that milieu.
Yes, that's an interesting question, given the vastness of the what we call the Jewish bookshelf,
Right,
right?
right, right.
Meaning
Well, Christian,
everything that's ever been written,
yeah,
or any other religion, but certainly from my own,
yeah,
kind of
yeah,
personal perspective,
yeah,
that vast Jewish bookshelf really presents an opportunity to embrace almost any position on any scale that one might want, and even embrace multiple positions at the same time,
yeah.
right? We, as collectively as Jews, we have believed and continue to believe, perhaps, in a God of war, as well as a God of mercy, compassion, and justice. And there are texts to back that up. And there always will be. So it's very hard to sort of say, oh, well, mine is a religion of peace. And so therefore it has led me to be a peace activist.
Right.
No, one of the reasons I'm a peace activist is partly because of the peace component within my faith, but also because I actively challenge the narrative of a God of vengeance and war that I read regularly in my textual tradition. And
And
I
do
have
you
to contemplate that.
let me interrupt for just a second because this is really intriguing to me. Would you say your tradition encourages you're debating the tradition? Uh, can you say something about that? Because I think
Sure.
because my experience of Judaism is that there's an internal conversation always going on within Judaism. So it's permissive of the challenge, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Is it?
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely. Well, I think that one of the things that made me fall in love with Judaism, especially as that young adult who left America not knowing where he'd end up and then finding himself in this very vibrant Jewish community in Jerusalem, and through that learning process is, in very, very sort of rough terms, there are two main kind of eras of Judaism. One, the biblical era, which is a lot of
Right.
God said, and
Right.
therefore one does. And then there's that shift over, a process of a few centuries into a rabbinic conversation, which
Right.
largely is rooted in the interpretation of text. And the nature of that rabbinic interpretation is constant, sort of challenging argument, disagreement, hopefully in an attempt to discover truth and to make Judaism practical and real. And so there's this concept that evolves in that early rabbinic moment called Machloket, which usually is translated as constructive disagreement. We are meant to
Yeah.
always disagree with each other and with the tradition, but only in this search for sort of or of truth. And so that concept of machloket, of constructive disagreement, has really propelled my commitment to Judaism and served as a foundation so that everything I encounter in my Jewish life, whether it's study or just living, should be part of that constructive disagreement. I should always want to think about it and maybe bring in those different opinions and texts and traditions that challenge each other, but not just to be argumentative, but because I actually want to try to glean some wisdom from my Jewish faith tradition.
So would there be forms of Judaism that would disagree what you just said?
I
That
would hope so, because that is
well,
the tradition.
right. Well, I guess what I mean is that they would agree that you're still a Jew if you disagree with them. You know what I
Yeah,
mean?
so there's once you introduce that notion of machloket, of constructive disagreement, then there's like an inherent conflict of, well, who gets to
Right.
decide? So
Exactly.
there are some
Exactly.
Jewish communities that are constructed with a little bit more hierarchy, right? You would have maybe a rabbinical leadership
Right.
figure, or
Right.
maybe even a political figure
Right.
that would be sort of the decisor for that community. Whereas I live in a Jewish world that doesn't have that hierarchy. And so therefore it's much more, kind of groundswell of encounter engagement with text and with other.
So you are an Orthodox Jew, correct? Would you
I
call
don't use
yourself?
that term.
What do you
Um,
use? What do you use?
Largely because in Israel, we tend not to use the movement terms as
Right,
often
right,
as
right.
you would find in the diaspora. They do exist, but it's largely a modern introduction. In
Gotcha.
Israel, we have a tendency to divide our own Jewish world into a very simplistic kind of black and white scenario, where most Israeli Jews would either define themselves as religious or as secular.
Okay.
Clearly, that is not a very fair reflection on anyone's faith identity,
Right.
especially given that living in a Jewish state can mean that secularism is deeply imbued with Jewish identity. It just may not
Yes.
be coming from sort of a
Yes.
godly source or a religious textual
Right.
element.
Right.
So
Right.
I identify as religious, but again, that doesn't necessarily say much about me until you bombard me with questions, understanding where I might fit in.
Right.
So I would argue that I want to live a life of Jewish practice and Jewish law, but as a cynic and as one who embraces that concept of constructive disagreement, I have found myself sort of on the very far edge of a world of living Jewish law, meaning I very much disagree with a lot of the traditions that most religious Jews would probably say accept as, this is mainstream Jewish life. So I'm always overthinking and overchallenging, which, makes me a very difficult person to live with.
Well, that's why we love you, Jared.
Right.
That's the way it goes. I think I think this conversation is actually interesting, especially for American Christians, because it situates the whole religious identity thing
Mm,
differently. Because it's more complicated in our universe, and it's certainly among Christians. What makes it for a quote real Christian, and what are the identifiers, and so on. So it's useful to have your story to sort of situate our own story a bit. Because as a Christian, I would tell you I'm in dialogue with the theology. I'm not just I'm not a just a literalist believer. I'm in
sure.
dialogue with what the tradition is giving to me, and that's part of the agenda. And hopefully, healthy religion encourages the dialogue because we're going on to greater and greater levels of wisdom and glory, right? Anyway, but let me get off that for a moment and say, so what, this is kind of an overbroad way to get at it, but what's life been like since October 7th and 2 years ago? And what's it been like? What's it like on the ground? And how do your values come into play? And as you know, my interest in this podcast is living in the meantime, is as all of the world is coming at us 1,000 miles an hour, we still have to get up and do our thing. And we have to we're living our lives, like it or not. So I'm kind of curious about how that's been working out for you. And you can take it any way you want.
Okay. So here I'll do it maybe chronologically
Okay.
because I think
Okay.
that sort of shows a little bit about kind of where we were and how we got to the moment we're in now.
Yeah.
There are different planes at work here. There's sort of that national plane, how we as a society experienced October 7th, and that goes for Israelis and Palestinians. And then there's sort of my own personal experience. So I'll
Yes.
focus on the personal, and if you want to branch out from there, that's fine. Um, I I think like most Jewish Israelis, the initial experience of living, in that moment, in that meantime, was trauma, was fright and just horror.
Yes.
Obviously, um, it happened on a holiday. As a religious Jewish family, we were disconnected from the news, from our devices, from media. And so in our neighborhood, as the word spread, it wasn't spreading sort of effectively. And so it took a while for folks to understand what exactly was happening. And as soon as that hit, as soon as the realization became clear, and especially as the holiday ended and we all turned on our devices, there was that kind of that moment of everything sinking in and realizing this is one of the deepest traumas that the Jewish people have ever faced, certainly in the land of Israel. And so that really defined, I would say, a long stretch of time as we heard about friends that were involved, children of friends that were at, that famous music festival in the desert, who were either killed immediately or taken captive into Gaza. um, Hearing from neighbors and community members who were immediately called up as part of the reserves for national service, given that it was clear that this was now going to evolve very quickly into a full-blown military conflict. And then resulting in more funerals, more injuries, physical and psychological. And so there was that whole kind of national trauma moment playing out that my family and I had enough connection to that we were feeling it. On the other hand, perhaps as immigrants from English speaking communities, living in Jerusalem, which is a physical distance from the front line of conflict. And at that point, at least, not having any of my three children who were currently serving their country, we somehow managed to escape, I would say, the brute force of that, of direct impact of feeling that moment. So we were
Did you
kind of peripheral.
were your children already in the IDF or not?
At that point on October 7th, my daughter had recently finished her service and was studying at a university in America,
Okay.
where she still is today. And my middle son, who's now serving, had
Right.
not yet
Gotcha.
begun
Okay.
serving.
Okay.
So we were
Yeah.
just in between. I mean, I hesitate to use the word lucked out because that's not
I
really a reflection,
I
but
hear you.
it was quite miraculous, really, that my children either weren't at the music festival or in the military service, which is how most folks were affected physically by that moment 2 years ago.
Yep.
So that was really kind of the initial experience. There was the living in the bomb shelters because all of the rocket attacks that were going on, and just general, trauma. How do we function? How do we sort of deal with this? There were sort of two things that happened that I felt were very defining of my living in that meantime. Um, One was, unlike most of my Israeli friends and neighbors and peers, I have a tremendous amount of connections to my Palestinian friends
Right.
and colleagues.
Right.
It's not very common, given the divides that really define Israeli and Palestinian society. And so I was kind of taking on a certain amount of trauma as a Jewish Israeli. Again, not as personal as it could have been, but still. And at the same time, I am in communication with Palestinians, both in the West Bank and in Gaza. And so starting to kind of ingest a little bit that element of trauma, although obviously a little bit more distant from my own space. So, but nonetheless, just kind of threw me for a loop, as especially we learned more and more about how the situation in Gaza was going to evolve, given the power dynamic, right? The very vast mismatched power dynamic between Israel and Hamas. So that was one element that sort of defined that moment. Is I was constantly, in my mind at least, kind of balancing out this need to feel part of the collective Jewish Israeli community in that traumatic moment, while at the same time wanting to feel compassion for my Palestinian friends and neighbors, and not wanting it to be all about, oh, I was affected as a Jew. This was aimed at Jews, and so therefore Jews must defend, must retaliate, must, prevent it from happening again. That's a very singular and important approach, but clearly not representing the whole picture. And then the second thing I would say that sort of defined that moment for me personally is that, partly because of the war, partly because I think of the fear that rippled out of the land to the rest of the world, watching the war play out on screens in a way that maybe no other war had done before. Everything in my professional world shut down because I teach almost exclusively internationals. So all of those academic programs shut down. All of tourism came to a halt. And so, not to be too selfish, but it very clearly defined my experience really for the last 2 years, was not having a work outlet, not having a way to generate income and support my family. And so that was I would say, a pretty powerful component, partly because it then enabled me to do things. I had so much free time, so I started to jump into this new civic reality of volunteering that I would say the state of Israel had never seen to that level before, right? What does it mean to actually support communities in need in a time of war? So there was all these efforts that came out of nowhere in a remarkable fashion, and I was able to participate in that because I had very few other demands on my time. And then it also evolved into the inability to support my own family and, kind of deal with the financial realities of life, so that I actually needed to leave the country, as hard as it was. And I have spent a good portion of the last 2 years traveling the world and teaching in order to be able to sustain myself and my kids. And so that put me in a weird place of physical distance, right, from that conflict as well. So there's all these different elements that have sort of evolved over time. I would say for me personally, I moved away from that kind of initial feeling of trauma as a Jew, and more sort of the trauma of a human, in being able to take that step back, bring in both the trauma of my Jewish friends and neighbors, but also of my Palestinian friends and colleagues. And then with the physical distance, traveling the world, teaching about the conflict, teaching about the history that leads up to the conflict, able to kind of take even a wider view on everything going on and really kind of focus in, how do I want to respond to this? And Steve, as you know well, my response basically was, I need to double down in terms of education towards peace and activism towards building relationships. Because it was very clear that 2 years of warfare, in my eyes anyways, was not going to arrive at the results that most people wanted, whether it was releasing hostages, releasing Palestinian prisoners, ending violence, ending destruction. I don't think we really accomplished almost any of that during the war. And so most of my time that I've been able to devote to being involved actively in this conflict has been very hyper focused on education towards building peace and peace activism itself, meaning being out in the field, working hand in hand, Israelis and Palestinians, on literally anything that was contributing towards the sustenance for communities.
Did you experience being an outlier in these feelings and commitments within Israel or not? Or what do you think? How did you
Yeah,
go ahead?
absolutely.
Well, you
I
did.
mean,
Okay.
I don't think it's too much of a secret that Israel and Palestine, although we share the same land, at least conceptually speaking, we live very, very separate from one another. It is quite
Right.
rare, sadly, in my opinion, to be engaged on a regular basis with each other. Of course, we see each other in the streets. There's economic engagement because there kind of has to be, again, given the political and power dynamic. But generally speaking, it's very easy to grow up, certainly as an Israeli. It's a little bit harder as a Palestinian, but as an Israeli, it's very easy to grow up and live your life without any meaningful sort of contact with Palestinians. Palestinians, being on the sort of the other end of that power dynamic, are often kind of forced into at least some contact, if not relationship, with Israelis. But it is, again, it is sort of the norm to just separate, partly out of, understandable fear, right? We both have this narrative, as I said in the beginning, of othering each other, or even, kind of boxing us in as the enemy. And so that's something that I don't experience. And therefore, that does make me a bit of an outlier. I wouldn't say anybody cast me out of any kind of, community construct because of what I do, but I definitely don't fit that mainstream narrative, certainly not post October 7th.
Does your family share your passions?
Not to the obsessive extent that I do. I'm sure I have added layers of trauma to my children's experience, just because I am quite aggressive
Yeah,
in my search for peace and for building relationships.
right.
Um, I would say that pretty much as a family, we all believe the things that I strive to achieve and certainly educate on a regular basis. I am definitely more focused on that, and that has become predominantly my life. Whereas my kids certainly have other pursuits and are, I'd like to think, living the life of young people in Israel, which enables them to experience lots of different things. But just as an example, I raised all three of my children in a youth movement that is rather unknown in mainstream circles called Kids for Peace, where instead of going to, let's say, the Scouts or one of the religious youth movements, which is very, very popular in Israeli Jewish circles, my kids went to meetings where they would encounter Palestinian kids from a relatively young age. And there were no politics there. There was very little faith involved as well. It was mostly just meeting each other as humans and playing or talking to each other and just as a way of innocently building a sense of friendship and equality, so that as those children got older through that movement, they would eventually be able to have these important conversations, but very much as peers, right, as equals.
Yes.
And so I think that experience very much kind of directed my kids into a similar path that I'm on, and they didn't seem to fight back. I think they very much appreciated it and embraced it.
Do they
Um,
identify as religious?
oh, that's a good question. I
By the
would
way,
have
you
to
don't have to answer any question I ask. I
let's just
because
say this.
it'd be tricky for me to answer that question too. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
yeah, yeah, yeah. The word itself is always a bit of a stumbling
Well,
block
that's
for
true.
reasons I
Right. Yes.
explained.
Right.
But I will say this is that all three of my children, I would say, and I think they would agree, have a very strong sense of Jewish identity and not just cultural Jewish identity. But each of the three of them has found their own path in terms of observance and what they're interested in.
Right.
But I certainly don't perceive that any of them have full on rejected a sort of Jewish faith identity, which makes me very happy. And I love to see that each of them has chosen their own path because once again, that's the constructive disagreement that I would
Right.
expect nothing less.
Right. Right. So, what's this? You know, it's kind of a silly question in a way, but what's the status of Israeli-Palestinian engagement? And I know that you've been so much on the ground, and I well remember our visits into the West Bank. And by the way, how's the brewery in Taipei? Is that still going on?
I haven't been in a while. As you might imagine, travel over the last 2 years has
Yes.
been quite a quite a challenge, especially within Palestinian areas. Given the tension that was clearly, developing in the Gaza Strip, there was also a kind of a peripheral tension or a residual tension that was being projected onto the West Bank, initially out of fear, right, that Palestinian communities would push back and, rise up as the news of the war in Gaza kind of spread. But not only that, there was all kinds of political shifts in the way that the West Bank was being administered by Israel, such that you
Yes.
have a
Yes.
more mainstream political movement that kind of oversees what you might call either the occupation or the administration or whatever in the West Bank. A lot of that was shifted towards the active home front, thereby leaving a more local and sometimes meaning more radical leadership in the West Bank, where Jews who are sometimes very deeply committed to either just the settlement movement or maybe even a loftier religious goal, a messianic vision of greater Israel, right? There are lots of different nuances there, but nonetheless, that dynamic changed quite a bit, meaning that over the last 2 years, engaging with my Palestinian friends and colleagues in the West Bank has become far more difficult than anybody ever imagined, simply because of physical roadblocks and restrictions being placed by Israeli authorities. Again, not the ones we've been used to working with, but this new
Yes.
kind of world of Israeli authority that is mostly coming from the ground there.
So can you pass into the West Bank these days?
So as an Israeli Jew, I can do pretty much whatever I want, but that doesn't mean it doesn't come with complications. Just as an example, every year in the fall, literally just before I left Israel to come to America to teach, we have the traditional olive harvest period
Right. Right.
where
We
as sort of
participated in that at one time.
exactly, as a simple
Right.
sign of solidarity and our love for the land, there are many different Jewish communities that will go out and harvest with their Palestinian, neighbors,
Right.
largely because Palestinians do often face certain obstacles to doing such, given, land regulations and zoning laws and permits and whatnot. And this year we faced not only more limitations by the military and by some of the local Jewish communities in the West Bank, but we also witnessed a rise in violent acts directed at us, the Jewish Israelis, who were working alongside our Palestinian friends and neighbors. So even though I have the right and the ability to get to pretty much any community I want to, once I get there, there could be a whole nother reality waiting for me, which sadly has become far more dire than we have seen ever, I think, at this point.
Yeah. Are you, uh, this is again another seemingly silly question about using these words that kind of have multiple meanings, but are you hopeful? And I guess I'm wondering how you're reading the current condition. And I don't mean hopeful from the, eternal sense, but how are you reading the tea leaves given current conditions, your experience, your peers, what
I would say first and foremost, what I understand to be my Jewish faith tradition is very much built on hope,
yes.
especially the part of the Jewish narrative that often is oversimplified in that we are constantly facing, obstacles and challenges, and yet as Jews, we sort of always overcome. And I don't say that necessarily in a religious sense. I mean that in a very practical sense. As a historian and an educator, it's not difficult to sort of look back, through the pages of all of our textbooks and see kind of one challenge after another that we seem to have surmounted and managed to move on. So as a student of history, I really have no choice but to be hopeful because I know we can do it. We've done it before. I would say the second thing that brings me to a very hopeful place is that I've now spent the better part of 30 years teaching and working and traveling in an environment where there really are no obstacles to peace, right? Once I have sort of gotten over the whatever mental block may have existed in my introduction to life as a Jewish Israeli, that there is an other out there or there is an enemy out there. Once I got past that, I now see and I have experienced for many years that making Palestinian friends, building trusting relationships, working together on projects, even seeing sort of the future of these two national narratives somehow coexist either side by side or maybe on top of one another, there really have been very few obstacles in my personal experience. So that gives me a tremendous amount of hope because I literally live from day to day in that very blended world, right? As a very committed and truly rooted Israeli Jew, but also one who I see no opposition whatsoever to a world of Palestinian expression of identity, sovereignty, independence. The challenge really is getting more people on board, largely through having those encounters and educational experiences. And that's where obviously the main obstacle lies, is that we have far too many decades, if not centuries, of training that both sides are maybe too hesitant to engage out of fear. And so, therefore, the primary narrative has become we need to build up our defenses, we need to be wary of the other, and maybe we're not ready to make peace or engage. The last 2 years, unfortunately, have set us back tremendously. There are fewer people than ever before who maybe would even be willing to express an interest in meeting a Palestinian, having that conversation for the first time as a baby step towards building a relationship that will change their conceptualization of the entire, reality. And so I feel very blessed that I live the life that I live, but I also have to remind myself daily that I live a life that most certainly Jewish Israelis do not live. So I have tremendous amount of hope, and I feel like I have a lot of evidence to back it up, that it's not a challenge, that it's very easy once you kind of get going on that path. Um, but I see the challenge that awaits in bringing along both of these nations, all of the peoples that live in the land, along for the ride.
Where do you get your resilience from, Jared? I mean, you've described a hopeful scenario in the midst of sort of a chronic, difficult environment. So, how do you put the pieces of the puzzle together for yourself and come out so positively resilient?
Well, I should first be honest and say I may not be as resilient as you think. Um, Certainly, the last 2 years have offered plenty of opportunity for depression, and
Yes.
sort of
Yeah.
really asking those deep questions, especially again in my very irrelevant personal experience of not having any work, right? Granted, plenty of people were suffering much worse, but waking up every day and wondering, what am I supposed to do? How do I pay my rent? How do I feed my kids? I'm
Yes.
not sure
Yes.
that resilience was a was something that I was kind of portraying to the world. But I feel very confident that that there is at least a modicum of resilience that propels me forward. And I would say that I glean most of that from the activities that I participate in. Because there's very little that I can do either in my professional life or in my activist life alone. I am constantly sort of forced into these situations where I'm either teaching in partnership, right, to be able to convey multiple narratives, right, different histories, different perspectives, or as an activist, it's all about that partnership and engaging with different communities to meet different needs. And so every time I show up, it is literally the people who are there in the field, even if there's only 7 of them, that give me a sense of resilience. Like if they're there, then who am I not to show up? And so that has, I would say, that has been certainly the brunt force behind whatever resilience I might have. I would add to that probably a little bit of my relationship with my certainly my textual faith element as a student of the beautiful Jewish bookshelf, as I mentioned earlier. There's a lot of resilience in there as well that
Sure.
I find very
Absolutely.
inspirational.
Absolutely.
But it is primarily that human element of just showing up and seeing that the activities are going to happen whether I'm there or not. So I better be there.
Just as an aside, I remember when 9/11 happened, um, it was the Jewish texts that provided the substantial sense of the grand vision of hopeful future. And so I know what you're pointing to. I don't know it as
Right.
well as you probably, but I know what you're pointing to in that. So you're in the States now and teaching, and how long will you be here, do you suspect?
Well, this time around, I have been very clear to limit my my visit to 6 weeks.
Oh,
I
wow.
arrived,
Okay.
yeah. The previous academic year, I was here for just over 8 months,
Right.
and I taught in 13 different states, which I do not recommend to anyone. It was a lot of travel. It was a relatively lonely experience just living on the road, but I was very blessed to be able to do something like that, both in terms of, again, supporting my family, paying my rent, but also recognizing that as an American citizen, I have that opportunity to leave my home and come to another country and teach, legally with no kind of prohibitions. Many of my Israeli colleagues are unable to do that, or at least not as freely as I do. And very few of my Palestinian colleagues can even get out of their community, if they even have a standing community, again, depending on where they live, to be able to do something like this. So whatever struggles I may have experienced, it was definitely worth it. But it did teach me that I needed a break in between. So this time around, I got here about 2 weeks ago. I have about 4 weeks left. And so I'm only here for a total of 6 weeks, serving as scholar in residence for different communities throughout the Northeast. And then I'll go back to Jerusalem. Things are starting to turn a corner a little bit in the sense of many communities around the world beginning to re-engage with Israel-Palestine and sort of sharing a little bit of a desire to come back and learn or travel and experience. So I do have a little bit of work waiting for me back home. I hope that will continue to evolve so that I can return to a normal life of teaching, guiding and engaging with people from around the world rather than having to keep shuttling back and forth between North America or Europe and my home in Jerusalem.
So are you all booked up for these 4 weeks, or could you still use a offer or two?
For you, Stephen, anything. But I am yeah, predominantly booked up
Okay.
because it was a relatively short time frame, and I have much experience with so many communities. Again, over a span of at least 25, 30 years.
Right.
So as soon as people hear that I'm on my way, I generally get plenty of requests to teach, and so I'm very blessed. I have a lot
It
of work that is keeping
it,
me busy while I'm here.
it occurs to ask you, do you have a not-for-profit that is engaged in the peace building in Israel that we could advertise here? I mean, there might be people, listeners, who would be pleased to make a contribution to the kind of effort you've described and have committed yourself to. Is there such a thing? I'm
Wow.
assuming there is.
There are many. Asking me to choose one is like asking which of my kids is my favorite.
Well, which one? No, I'm just
Well, that actually I could tell you. They wouldn't be very happy with that.
no, no, no. But well, give us a choice, and we can kind of include it in our
Okay.
in
Can
our
I mention
commentary.
two that happen to
Sure,
be very
sure,
sort of recent?
absolutely,
Right.
and
I might
maybe
even
with a little bit of a description of them, because
yeah,
we
yeah, yeah. I
go
I
ahead.
I think I'm gonna have to even enlarge that to 3, otherwise people are gonna get very mad at me, but I'll make it very,
Okay,
very brief. And they
yeah,
each actually touch on a very different aspect of the current moment,
okay,
and what it means, as you say, to sort of live in the meantime right
right,
now.
right,
Um, so the first one is actually in an academic institute that I'm a part of as sort of an adjunct called the Arava Institute. It's a branch of Ben Gurion University. It's situated in the Arava deserts in the south of the state of Israel. It is an environmental institute that brings together Israeli students, Palestinian students, Jordanians, Egyptians, and internationals to basically recognize that anything involving our climate and environment doesn't really care about these silly human borders between us. And so we
right,
really have no choice but to engage with each other, live with each other, and solve problems together.
right.
Just before I flew to the United States, I led a week-long a cycling trip through the deserts of the
It was
land
so
in order
post.
to, yeah, in order to raise money for the Arava Institute. And one of the projects that I have very little to do with, but I am extremely proud, even just to have an association with the Arava Institute, is that they've partnered with a Palestinian organization in the Gaza Strip called Damor to initiate a project called Jumpstarting Hope in Gaza. And it is a project that has been going on for nearly the full 2 years of the war in providing real sustainable solutions to communities there, and specifically showing the communities who benefit from those solutions that the ideas and the practicalities are coming from an Israeli-Palestinian partnership. Once again, the only way out of this sort of military mess
Yes,
is to build some sort of civil discourse
yes,
between these two worlds. So that's
yes.
one element that I am very excited about, and I talk about quite a lot, especially because my personal role working with the Arava Institute. The second initiative I'll share briefly is called Rabbis for Human Rights. You can probably guess from the name, it's largely Jewish clergy and sort of associated friends, colleagues, educators like myself, who engage in activities that are generally meant to further, according to our Jewish textual visions, human rights in the land. And so one of the activities they're most well known for is the annual olive harvest, which I already mentioned.
Yes. Yep.
This year, as I said, was the most challenging of all. And so it's an organization that does that and other amazing activities in taking our Jewish textual identities, our religious faith traditions, and basically implementing them, saying, this is what we believe. Let's do it. Let's do it on the ground and engage with people, recognizing their humanity, showing them that we as Jews are not, the evil that might be portrayed or educated, within certain Palestinian arenas, and really build those relationships. And
Yeah.
so that has been, and certainly my involvement with them in education, but also as an activist, has been very, very meaningful, very, very powerful, especially this year. And then the last one I'll just mention, so I don't get in trouble, because I am very, very involved. I happen to be on the board of an organization called the Interfaith Encounter Association. And here we essentially serve as an umbrella organization where we try to initiate, sustain, and help develop very small encounter groups that could literally happen anywhere in the land. Israel, Palestine, doesn't really matter, where we're simply bringing people together. It doesn't
Yeah.
need to be a concrete goal. It doesn't have to have any end result. It is simply just finding ways for people to connect. It could be studying a text together. It could be because everybody's studying at the same university. It could be two neighboring communities on a hilltop in the middle of nowhere that just
Yeah.
see each other out the windows, but they don't have an excuse to
Right.
converse. And so we try to create these. We have somewhere in the vicinity of about 40 active groups all over the land where just Israelis and Palestinians are coming together as Muslims, as Christians, as Jews, and just having conversations. And hopefully, once again, down the long road, it will lead to lasting relationships that we can do more productive things with.
I'm actually grateful. I'm glad I thought of it to ask you because, as we're entering this season of Thanksgiving and in the Christian tradition, Christmas and so on, we call this, and of course, with Hanukkah on its way as well, we call this the season of lights that's upon
Mm.
us. And I'm very conscious that so many of our listeners have been kind of lost in the quagmire of what's been going on in Israel-Palestine, and with emotions running high, and people generally are feeling powerless in the midst of a lot of stuff that's coming at them. And so I'm glad I thought to ask you, because a simple way with an advocate like yourself who's invested in the kinds of causes you're invested in there might speak to a lot of people. And who knows, right? So
Thank you for
you
the
can
question.
provide that info to us, and we'll include it somewhere in our podcast here.
Absolutely.
I know Brandon has been monitoring us. He hasn't spoken, but and I don't want to leave you out, Brandon, if you have a word or not. It's okay if you don't, but I just wanted to acknowledge that Brandon, I'm thankful for Brandon. He's been a big help in me getting this whole project launched. And in this season of Thanksgiving, grateful for your presence, Jared. Grateful that you were able to make this happen. And we'll stay in touch, of course, and more to come for sure. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Been a pleasure.
Thanks for joining us again on Living in the Meantime with Stephen Bauman. You can go to stephenbauman.com to subscribe to the Substack or any of our podcast links. In the coming weeks, be looking for more interviews and longer form podcasts that will be posted to the channel. We'll see you next week.